Okay, let's get this show on the road. Okay, so all the best maps start out first with a bit of research. Today we're going to be mapping Bimisari, a relatively well-documented planet in the mid-rim. Now, the information that's on Wikipedia is pretty reasonable for this particular planet. We've got a couple of images. We've got this nice one here of a main city, and then we have another view which looks to be looking across some plains in the background there, which gives you a good initial idea of the kind of at least level of technology and kind of terrain we'll be looking at in this particular planet. And obviously you have the terrain and physical information that Wikipedia provides. So here we have forests and plains, and then it also mentions that there are these Asari trees, which are these particular kind of partially sentient trees that move of their own accord. And there's a reasonable monument in one of the major cities of the planet called the Tower of Law. Now, when I make a map of a particular planet, when it has this kind of information, I do aim to include the kind of landmarks that show up. So in this case, the Tower of Law is a pretty good example, and this general kind of market area would be quite nice to have. And it makes sense that, for example, the military base may be defending the Tower of Law, since it seems like a kind of governmental nexus on the planet. So the next step, after doing a bit of research on the planet, and so in this case, we're looking at kind of a jungly plains kind of areas. Think about what kind of area on planet Earth best matches that particular terrain. So in this case, what I'll do is go on this other website called terrain.party, which is a really good way to get height maps, because what you usually want to do when you're first starting a map is get the height map set up as soon as possible. So you want the terrain levels set up and arranged in advance so that you can get going without having to worry about messing around with the frankly abysmal height editing tools that the map editor has. So by default, it starts you off in Finland because this website is technically for city skylines. But I'm thinking South America is a pretty good place to start. Perhaps Argentina. That has a decent mix of jungle and plains. So another thing to do is actually just look for some nice images of the place that you're going to be basing your map off. So here we go. Here's Argentina. It's a bit, maybe these images suggest that Argentina is a bit too mountainous. For Bimisari in particular, we want somewhere that's a bit flatter. So maybe there's a place in Africa that would be more appropriate. Now, this particular website, terrain.party, allows you to get height maps from anywhere in the world. However, the resolution is a lot better in the United States because that uses the what is it now? The USGS survey, whereas the rest of the world just uses space shuttle surveys, which are a bit lower resolution. So let's see. It's probably a bit of Africa that's not too bad. Something like because you've got a band of rainforest in this region, which is appropriate forest, and there's quite a bit in the way of Serengeti and plains. So maybe Ethiopia is a good choice. Let's have a look. Oops, can't spell Ethiopia apparently. So again, Ethiopia looks maybe like it's a bit too mountainous for Bimisari, though there's a part of the country in the south there that looks a bit flat, though that's probably a bit too much of a desert for the country we're looking for. But of course, the thing is, when you're looking at this kind of thing, the actual vegetation in the area doesn't matter too much because you're only going to be extracting the height of the area. So let's grab a bit of southern Ethiopia from terrain.party. Now, I'd like to increase the size quite a bit because these low-resolution shuttle maps are well, they're low resolution, so you end up with some areas that are perhaps need to be scaled back down again when you put them into the map editor. So let's have a look. So we've got a few national parks around here, which are often a good choice. They tend to have a nice selection of different terrain. Let's go for this area up here, because grabbing a river or a lake is a pretty good choice too, because that lets you get in some very natural looking water features when you're making this kind of more earth-based planet. Hit the download button. Let's call it. Sorry, probably missed an S off there, but no one cares. Right. So from this website, you get these different height maps. So this is the merged height map, which is probably what we'll be working on. This looks pretty nice. So we've got like a river delta here. We've got a flat top mountain, which is interesting. Most of this will probably be on the outside edge of the map. The main play area, I find you want to be generally as flat as possible with some strong features, because the pathfinding in the game doesn't like it when you start to do complex stuff. So I think this will be a good image to start with. So let's just extract that to my really messy maps folder. I've got a height map 2D. So these are the selection of height maps I've put together over the years for various maps I've made for the Phoenix Rising mod. And this one's not going to be any exception. So we'll just pull this up in GIMP. And I can close all this. Keep that open because it's a good reference to have. This PDF I have here is the Thrawn Trilogy source book. It's a very useful reference for a number of worlds that maybe don't have as much information on Wikipedia as you'd like. Generally, checking the sources in Wikipedia is a good thing to go with, because you'll get some more information that way about exactly what's available out there. And if you can find the PDFs of these old RPG books, or if you have the physical books yourself, that can be pretty helpful. So generally, I find the best size for a Galactic Conquest land map, at least in the Phoenix Rising mod, where we have a particular scale that we go with, is 8x8 patches. That's the scale I go with very consistently. If the planet's less important, maybe I'll go a little smaller. If it's very important, I may go up to 9, maybe 10 at the very absolute maximum. So let's just go make a new map. So we want to choose, I think, forest. Let's focus on the forested area of the of Mimsari. Now note that all that really does is change the mini-map colors, and then we obviously go branched because we're making a Galactic Conquest map, single player. I like to put map levels up to 5 just because who the hell knows what kind of bugs you can come into if you don't. And then I'll leave the playable map area as it is and set the width to 8x8. So with 8x8, that's 249 vertices, or whatever the technical term is for this particular thing, but so circuits, yes, 249 vertices. So 249 by 249, and so that's what you want to scale your height map to. So you notice that the height map comes out 1081 by 1081, and that's partly why I get a kind of a zoomed out, a larger like 40 by 40 kilometer or 50 by 50 kilometer area in terrain.party, because it always outputs at the same resolution. So if you increase the size of the area you're picking up, then the resolution looks a bit better. You don't, because these maps like 30 meters per pixel, which is not great to work with sometimes. So let's just scale the image down to 249 and see how it looks. And then think about what kind of playable area we want to go with here. So here we are back down 249 by 249. So we've got a nice tall area here, which will probably end up being background, or at least a large blocker in the region. This river suggests to me that that's made with this small mountain, that maybe that's where we want to locate the base and the city. Maybe the city goes behind here with that Tower of Lore and some nice props. And you have more of a forested area outside the city and the base between the attackers who land in the forest and city. And then you also have this natural defense of the river here, which slows infantry down and slows down some vehicles. And you can put bridges in and such if you want. And maybe I'll think about doing something like that in a bit. But I think this is perfectly fine as it stands. I got pretty lucky, to be honest, with this. So we'll just save it now as a scaled down image. And I'll minimize this because I may need to come back and tweak some of this. So before you load the height map, you want to set a max height. I find 200 to 300 is a good start. And you hit recompute height map and nothing happens because you haven't got a height map yet. But then we want to load the height map in. PNG image is fine. I should note that you don't have to choose the map size in vertices when you start, because when you load in any arbitrary height map, it will set, well, the height map should be square, but it will actually set the size of the map to the resolution of the height map. Okay, so here we are. This is the height map loaded in. You've got the kind of table. It looks like actually a caldera, which is really interesting, and that'll be a nice place to put in a kind of small forested area, perhaps, looking like a kind of plateau. And then you have the river that looks quite shallow right now. So what I'd like to do here is go into the passability view mode, which looks kind of broken right now with Control P. But then what we want to do is hit reset passability. The game will automatically compute the slopes of the vertices and will automatically highlight areas of impassable terrain, which is a good way to start to work out how steep you want the height map to be. So let's do that. So you can see the rivers kicking in there, but I think I want it to kick in more in the plains. The plains right now are very flat. I might need to do some of this manually because it looks like if I zoom in here, the river's very, very shallow. Maybe I'll go back into the height map in a moment in GIMP. But what I'm going to do first is bring the minimum down. Let's actually leave the minimum where it is. Now let's go to minus 20 is a good start. In Phoenix Rising in particular, we don't like to have very shallow. We want to have very shallow water because our infantry is scaled quite small. In the main game, you can get away with it at water depths of probably 30 if you want to push it. Always try and put an infantry unit into scale though. And let's scale the height back up a bit. Cool. Okay, and then let's just reset the passability again. So this has brought in a few more features, but it's still looking like the river is perhaps a little... Because of course in real life rivers can slope. In the game rivers can't slope because the water level's a single level. So let's bring the water table height up and you can see it's filling in the physical water delta, and then the actual river all the way at the top there doesn't fill up until we get to a very high water table height. So let's minimize this for now and go back to the height map in GIMP. So first thing is let's increase the contrast a bit. This is a bit like increasing the scaling of the height map, but not quite. Everything's appearing on my other monitor right now, which is annoying. Okay, let's increase the contrast. Decrease the contrast actually, and decrease the brightness. Okay, there we go. So we lose some of the detail. And it's very risky doing this because as you increase the contrast, areas like this area of the caldera here start to blow out, and you'll end up with very completely flattened areas. We can solve that relatively simply later by smoothing it out in the map editor. And the smooth tool is the one tool I use a lot. Maybe I'll just make this a complete table mountain kind of thing going on here. Let's see. So this entire area here is too dark, basically. And the river that we can maybe just about see if we zoom in is going to cause problems in terms of this will just end up being a giant lake. Which, you know, I picked an area with a lake, I think. But I think I'd rather this not be a lake. So we'll just get the... Oops. Actually, let's actually increase the brightness a little, increase the contrast a small amount, okay. And then just color pick around the edge of this kind of actual physical lake, and we'll just paint in. It can be real messy, but I suggest you do use one of the fuzzy edge tools, and just kind of color in this area so we fill in the lake, basically. And this means the river that actually is on the map is more useful to work with in the map editor. And then probably what we want to do is, let's actually undo that. Being a bit too overzealous there. Fill this in. And try and get it up to about the same level as the physical terrain is, otherwise you'll end up with very unsightly gaps. This is the kind of thing you can smooth out a bit in the map editor, but I'd also like to use the smudge tool to fix this before having to deal with the map editor, because the map editor, like I said, the height manipulation is a pain. Then probably what I'm going to do is zoom in here and actually grab a bit of this river depth and just paint this in with a small smooth edge circle to join these up. And you can see how much actually that ends up, this river here that looks dark actually ends up being higher than this basin area. So I think this, in retrospect, this height map might not actually work as well as I thought it was going to, which is a pain. That just means we have to go back to Terrain Party and find another one. And this is something that becomes very repetitive, but it's worth it in the end, because you end up with very naturalistic looking terrain that you can use in multiple different ways if you want. I think 50 kilometers was pretty well. Let's go down a bit to 40, because that means any rivers will actually be a reasonable size in pixels. Let's see. I was in a Wash National Park before. Maybe if I pick... This looks like a river basin where things are draining in, so it'll probably be quite low. This is probably some kind of valley. And you kind of want to avoid valleys because, like I showed, the map editor's water detection is kind of like the way the water levels work is kind of like, let's just pick this kind of flattish area, maybe have the lake in the corner. That's maybe a good one. Bimsari again, I'll just go Bimsari 2.0, blah blah blah. Oops, this is the Aster. This is the 30-meter scale, and then these are some of the shuttle missions. And basically, the merged version puts them all together, so you get a kind of decent range. Now, this one looks a bit too complex. You've got huge numbers of river deltas all over the map, which would be nightmarish to deal with in terms of terrain. And so again, head back and pick another region. Yeah, now this is quite a wide river. This might be good. Again, there's probably a potentially a steep valley here. So I'll just call it BIM because it's quicker. Potentially a steep valley here, which can cause some issues. Usually, I believe that on this OpenStreetMap view, the green areas are generally mountainous. They're green because no one wants to live there because they're mountains. Yeah, see, so this is the kind of ridiculous river valley you can get. It looks amazing, and for certain planets, this is potentially an incredible map. For Bimsari, where we want something a bit flatter, no, it's not great. And that's the risk of rivers. Rivers are great, but they tend to carve out valleys in reality, and that's pretty inconvenient when you're trying to just make a map that isn't just a valley. What about this one? Part of the reason to spend just so much time getting a good height map is that it saves you so much time in the future. Now this one is maybe perhaps a little too flat. You can see the river down here, and otherwise this is the kind of thing where the noise is very high in the image. Now, let me just see if I can open this in GIMP. I'm just going to see, maybe it would be doable if I mess with the brightness contrast, because this kind of ultra flat map isn't too bad. It just ends up being quite boring from a player perspective. It looks nice, but it'll look quite boring from a player perspective. And yeah, they see. And also, you need, quite often, part of the reason you want mountains at all is to hide the map edge, because that's a big deal when you're doing RTS maps in general, is having the map not just look like a plain in the middle of nowhere. A lot of modern games have much better ways of hiding it than Empire at War does. But Empire at War has a terrible way of hiding it, which is it doesn't. So it's best to try and find an area with some mountains on the edge, at least one edge of the map, maybe water on the opposite edge. So let's just pick this lake region instead. Worst case, I just go back to the previous one I was working with and try and mess with it a bit more. Okay, this one looks pretty nice. So we've got some interesting kind of terrain here, and then this lake off in the corner with some river deltas that probably won't actually become rivers in the map editor. They'll probably just be very small changes in the terrain that just look like noise, basically. Let's actually extract this one. Okay. Scale this back down to 49, so it's the right size of the map. And then let's just see how it goes. Often it's very difficult to tell what your map's going to look like until you just load it up in the map editor. Okay, this one looks pretty nice. So we've got, let's go off possibility mode. So we've got some pretty pointy mountains here, which are obviously scaled completely wrong compared to the game. But ultimately, I found that doesn't really matter from a visual standpoint. This mountain will be the background mountain, which will just kind of break up the horizon. Around this other edge, maybe what I'm going to do here is actually bring the minimum down to like -30. And here we go. So in this corner, we're now starting to get a lake show up. So if I bring the water table height up, start to fill that in, now we have a water edge, which is another good way to edge off the map and not have to worry about filling in with thousands of props to hide the edge of the map. So let's just reset the passability and see how that scaling has changed it. Okay, so what I like to, so this looks like to me like a natural base area is here, this region here, because you have this natural defense, natural choke point here from the mountains. You have a reasonable beachhead landing for the attackers, and then you have another path around this side, which also leads into the base. So you have the main entrance, which will be defended by the most turbo lasers and so on, and would be a reasonable thing to get your vehicles through. But then around this side, we have an alternate route, which probably has a lot of infantry-only areas. It's probably where we'll put the power generator. It's probably where we'll put some forest and some other the outbase structures that you don't care about so much will go out here, and they become a good raiding target for the attackers. Then out here, this is another decent place for a landing zone, so attackers can come in around this mountain and maybe go over the mountain if they have air transports of some kind. Right, so we've got a height map, at least the beginnings of it. It's going to probably be edited quite a lot, but mostly with a smooth tool. But let's move on to texturing. So what I like to do is, with textures, is keep things consistent. I want to have a particular. There's a bunch of default texture sets that are in the game that came with the map editor that I use all the time, because having a consistent texture set is the other half of the battle. If you can make your textures look consistent, the whole map seems to come together. You're not just picking random colors and throwing them together. Now, some planets can benefit from some out there colors, and that's something that I like to do by messing around with the diffuse coloring of the textures. So here we are now. We'll take the forest map set because that seems reasonable. And so we've got some kind of ripples here. What I like to do then is look at the general set of textures and work out what's going to go where. So now if we go back to, so we've got Ethiopia here, you've got these kind of browns, lots of browns and greens. And so this kind of region, we've got nice brown and green kind of striation in the terrain. And then here, some even more strong browns. And this kind of, again, strong browns and spots of green. And, whoops, we don't need GIMP anymore because this height map seems good. And so when you look at the textures, the good thing about the forest texture pack, it has a lot of those browns. A lot of them are actually set up to be mountainside. But if we... Now, I'm not sure if they fixed this with the latest version of the map editor, but if you just fill the entire map another color, because by default it has the top left one, if you pick another color and just fill, quite often the map editor will just crash. So I instead like to just fill in level by level. And what I mean by that is I'll take stuff at the lowest level of the map and fill up to the highest level. So I'm going to start out by filling in just with some mud underneath the water, because that's always a good start. Just get the biggest brush and just slap it on there. Maybe hide the water so you can see what you're doing. Get towards the edge and then bring the water back. And I don't even care about these outside islands, they really don't matter. And similarly, like the very edge doesn't really matter right now. This is where my speed in texturing comes in. It's by just getting in, blocking in these strong colors, and then working with them from there and doing some blending after the fact. So from the beach-ish, I mean it's a muddy beach, but it's kind of a beach, we're going to probably move on to the next kind of level. This one, because this map is relatively flat, it doesn't look like there'll be too many levels of texture. So this next one's going to be a pretty important choice in terms of what color we want to go with. Now, there's a bunch of different forest dirts that are a pretty good base out here. So there's smooth dirt, it's not too bad, might go with that. We've got forest dirt here, that's pretty nice too. Forest dirt here. These are actually the same texture, just rotated, and sometimes having two of the same texture but rotated is a really good way to get some interesting texture from the same texture. Then again, there's Forest Dirt 02, which actually I think looks best for this kind of plains area that we're going to be going with. It's going to be relatively dry until we get towards the edge of the mountains, where you get, in reality, you'll get rain shadows, which cause an increase in vegetation. So I think I'll just go with this this kind of dirt color to begin with. And again, it just comes down to splatting it down. Basically, this will probably just go across the entire map as the base texture. And having the base texture in is very important for getting a feel for how the map's going to look as a whole. And this is going to be what will peek through every other texture that you have, unless it's underwater, like the mud over there. So the thing, this corner where I'm planning on putting the city, it's fine, there's no mountains because the props will hide it. And conveniently with the forest world, again, it's very easy to fill in the edges with just lots of trees. And it doesn't even need to be lots of trees, the canopy props are very helpful in that regard. If you're working with a base game, obviously you have a slightly more limited selection of props than I might have. I have a few extras because of the mod I work with. Here we have, basically let's just actually do a save here, because the map editor is, even the newer version that they released, is crash happy. So I'd rather have multiple versions of the map available at any time. So this is just our naming convention. Okay. Right, so here we have the base layer. And with the base layer, now I can move on to some other layers. So we have these like small sticky up areas here that I'll probably go and grab one of the greens for, probably a darker green. Or let's go with one of these. Have a look at this dirt rock. Dirt rock's a pretty good one if I remember right. Let's go down to a smaller color. Sometimes you want to check the wireframe and just use the wireframe as a guide for where you should be putting this down, and then just kind of smoosh down, and then yeah, that seems like a reasonable color to start with here. Get in some forest areas, and then we'll just put in some of this green, because this is where it's not water, this is where you'll get accumulation of moisture. Thinking about this from like a climate perspective is pretty helpful. If you don't know much about that, just think about places you've been, pictures you've seen of real life. Go and look at the research like I mentioned here. Look at these pictures and work out where you're seeing greenery, where you're seeing areas of dryness, and just apply that to your maps. So this starts to become kind of a tabletop mountain kind of area here, very flat, large plateau. And it'll actually be quite a nice attack route, and I'm glad we have this here. So let's just start filling in the edges of this with the green. It will probably end up not being green in the end, but see how it goes. A lot of this will be smoothed out. These small lumps are really bad for pathfinding. The game can't deal with it. Units can't deal with it, and you have frustrated players yelling, the map's terrible. Okay, so there's a bit of greenery kind of lined in with some of the more minor areas of texture on the map. And let's move on to a bit more. Let's get the mountains in, I think. Let's start out with some. So I should note this particular texture set, these three are the ones that Petroglyph set up for mountain usage specifically. So they have a particular angle and a particular tilt. Now I don't tend to like using them for that reason, because if you do them at the wrong angle, that happens. It looks terrible. So instead, let's go for, how's that one? That one's not too bad. This one has a minor tilt angle, but is otherwise pretty flat. And then let's go back up to 200, and let's just go to wireframe and just cover this whole area. This is just the quickest way to get these things done. Otherwise, you will be mapping all day, every day, forever, which is not reasonable when you need to make maps for a mod with hundreds of planets. So we'll just fill in the areas that look like they should be mountainous due to their height. When you go back and you think, oh, that looks terrible, looks like garbage, but it's starting to get there. As stupid as it looks right now, it is starting to get there. And you notice, like from above, you see this tiling effect of the texture. That's something that we can blend in later. A lot of these problems can be fixed. Let's actually just turn the tilt angle off. A lot of these problems can be fixed with blending later. So now, as I noticed, this is kind of a stepped area. We have level, level, level. So that's a good place to start with getting in some different textures that aren't just this green and brown. So let's go up to a slightly different dirt. That one's maybe better for this lower area, lower plateau. Do we have a redder dirt? Smooth dirt? It's all right. So since we don't seem to have much in the way of an interesting redder dirt, which I think would be suitable for here, let's actually go and change the diffuse texture. So I just pick this random one, this random bit of dirt, and we'll just change the diffuse color. This changes essentially like the color of the texture by overlaying a color. So let's just do a very slight red tint, and you notice it's already a red dirt, just like that. It's a reddish dirt. And then you don't have to make hundreds of extra textures just to make your map look better. So this area here. So a lot of this is just waggling your hand around with the mouse to get this kind of texture filled in. But I think I'll be a bit more blasé about it and just fill it in like this. So here we have a kind of red level. Now this is kind of Z of what I'm looking at here. You can see in the bottom middle, the XYZ of the mouse is pretty helpful to use. This is Z110. So other areas of Z about 110 should probably be filled in with this kind of reddish as well, because that's just how you end up getting things in nature. You tend to get these kind of levels appear. So we've got another 110-ish region around here. And we've got 110 around the edge. And just keep track of the Z. And if you're going a bit too high, it doesn't really matter. All this can be fixed later. It's not a huge deal. And you start to get this kind of leveling effect where we've got this level here, about Z110, and then you've got this level up here, where it's the mountains. Let's go around the back side of the mountains. That's all a bit too high. So this actual area here, all this area here, is actually a much higher plateau. This whole area, which is where we're probably going to put the city in the base. It often makes sense to have the base on the high ground, partly for defensive reasons, partly for it looking better, and partly because it's just a preference. I go with having bases on the high ground, you know, Anakin high ground, etc. Let's go up. So this level, I think, might be a little greener. It's a bit sheltered by these mountains. So let's just pick this. All these basically the same. This Endor rock texture is pretty good sometimes. Maybe a little too green here. Again, this one's maybe too green, too dark. Often I'll just go through it. Like I don't have like a memory of every single texture, so I have to go through and redo them a few times just to see what's there. Temp ground, that's okay. Sometimes the texture's just not in the pack you've got. It's in this pack, and you just have to add another one. In this case, I think I might just go and get a slightly lighter colored grass color. So the temp ground are the ones you want for that. So this is a pretty good one. I quite like that yellowish grass. But this one here, this very pale yellow-green. So yeah, as Skibby mentioned in the chat, changing the diffuse color on textures is kind of risky sometimes. Different textures can respond different ways, but the best thing I can suggest there is just experiment. Oh yeah, also make sure some textures don't come with a default bump map, so you'll need to pick one. I think this one should technically have temp ground 01, probably. We'll soon find out if it's wrong. And then make sure the scale's right. 215 is the standard. That basically makes the texture a reasonable size on the map so that you're not just seeing the tile too much. So this is actually getting to the part where I can start using the fill tool, which makes things a lot easier. Bam, filled. So now we have another plateau area. This is the, what kind of level is this? 180, 200. So this whole area is about that level, but since this area here is a bit more exposed, it's the plains area with this probably the city, I'll probably keep this more dirt. So, oops, it's just the same dirt again. Genius, right? So a lot of this texturing work really is just putting in blocks. So I'll just put a block in here, put a block in here, just put a block in here, and a bit of a block in here. That one's even a bit too square probably, but let's just double check. So that's a bit too square, so just kind of fill it in. So there's a block. And then we just go ahead and grab another color. Just fill in a different block. And you just block it in. Keep blocking. And you don't really worry about what you're going to do in terms of like actual buildings or where you put the base yet, because that will dictate where a lot of the texture goes. So then we'll just put a bit in the middle here and a bit in the middle here, and that's kind of the levels we have. We have this kind of dryness effect where you get this reddish dirt which goes down to this brownish dirt. Now, as I mentioned, the edge of the map probably wants to be more forested, so that's where we grab the this nice greenish Endor rock and just kind of smoosh it around and have this fill in and act as the base for the forest. It won't really be visible in game, but it's helpful when you take the map image. The map will look a bit better, which is nice, and it helps emphasize that that's the forest area. Because Bimasari is meant to be forested, I'll probably have this region here be forested too, which means I should probably just put in a few blobs here. Cool, some blobs. Now, this looks pretty terrible right now. It looks like Babby's first map textures, which is fine. Because then what you do is the magic. You do the texture blending. This is the time-consuming part. This is the slightly tedious part, but it's the part that gets the best results. It's the part I found gives me the fastest map to release time in terms of me personally being happy with the map. So you find here we have a texture gap, a texture join, where you have two different textures. They're quite different colors, but that's not a huge deal. Connecting, just pick one of them. You get one of the smaller brushes. I find 20 is pretty good because it's two vertices. That means you get a decent circle without it looking jaggy and not looking too round. And then you just blend. You just blend them together, and this creates a natural ripple effect around the edge, which makes it look like the regions are bleeding into each other, which is what naturally happens. You get a natural effect of blending. So then we'll grab this greenish and we'll blend that in a bit and blend it in. And here, what I'll probably have to do in a moment after I've blended this is probably get another color and blend around the edge of this a bit, because the contrast is too high. You generally want to avoid really high contrast unless the particular planet you're working with is so out there and so strange that the high contrast makes it feel strange. And that can be pretty reasonable in terms of getting a good really alien planet. But this particular world is a bit more Earth-like, so we want to get that feeling of you're in Star Wars, but you're also in a set on California or something. Because to be realistic, that's how most of this stuff goes. Outside the map, you don't really need to worry about doing this particular blending method because no one's going to see it. So you just don't bother, because why waste time doing something that no player is ever going to see? If you start to feel like the areas of texture you're putting together are too large, that's when you start to break it up. So as I showed this giant area here, I put another couple of textures in the middle. That's when you just grab another texture that blends between the two textures you're working with and just slap it down and merge it in like I'm doing here with the screen, and you start to get a more realistic looking blend between the regions of the map. So like I said, this contrast is maybe a little high here, but it's not too bad. But this area is starting to look a little too repetitive. So one of the things you want to do to check how repetitive it's going to look in game is hold down the spacebar. If you can start to see and that gives you the game camera limits basically. If you start to see the tile, like I'm seeing here, then that's when you want to start to add in other textures. So let's start grabbing this smooth dirt. just filling in a bit here. And this starts to create a natural road here. And if we have a natural landing site here and natural roads that start to come up here, we just kind of just fill this in a bit, fill that in, and then we'll just stop here because we're already getting into these other dirt areas. What we'll do is grab the dirt texture here, try and be careful with these dirts that are very similar. Start blending around the edge, and just blend, blend, blend. Generally you want to blend from the smaller area into the larger area. Otherwise you start to just delete the smaller area and it defeats the point of having the patch of texture. Now a lot of people, I say a lot of people, I don't know how many people do mapping on Empire at War these days, but the noise tool is a pretty solid way to be doing this blending as well. I just don't like it very much because you don't have much control over the size of the brush. It's just a like 50, so 5 vertex brush that's in a cross pattern, or in a, well, that's the cross brush, and then there's a noise brush which is a bit more random. I think that's about 75, 100 map units in size, which is okay, but you can end up with issues with the you start to add get issues with the scale of the noise brush compared to the textures you're trying to blend together. So let's just blend this in a bit. I'm going to be pretty brief about this particular blending because this is where the base and stuff's going to be, so all this is probably written, so I don't do too much about blending this very well. And ultimately, when the textures are this low in contrast, the blending almost doesn't matter because it's almost invisible. Now, what does matter is these mountains. These mountains have very obvious tiling, and their blending is quite weak. So let's grab this texture and blend that in a bit, and then start blending it up the mountains. And then this again can help have the wireframe view. And you want to start trying to follow the striations of the mountain as best you can. And that starts to hide, especially with this kind of, you want to choose a texture if you're going up the side. Let's actually reduce the intensity of that a little. When you start to have textures that don't have the obvious repetition like this mountain texture I'm using, you can blend that in and it hides the repetition pretty well. And this color here that I'm using now blends reasonably well between the mountain and the base texture that I'm using. And bam, there you have a realistic looking rock mountain, just like that. 2, 3 textures and a couple of minutes of work. The downside with the mountains is, of course, that you want to kind of do that on the edge of the map as well, because the mountains are the bits that close off the map. But you can start to get away with doing some more interesting stuff on the very edge mountains, like here I might even bring in some of this interesting green, because why not? It's far in the distance. That could be giant trees of huge forests. Pinkish one again. So this particular mountain area here is pretty nice. It creates a pretty natural break. This is a lot like the kind of stuff that Petroglyph does in their own maps, except they tended to have to do it by hand. They used height maps a lot, but they would, if you load up vanilla maps, you can see the height maps, you can see the brush strokes they used to create them, and they create them, in probably Photoshop or something, which is a lot more work and a lot more effort than just grabbing stuff from Terrain Party. Or, for example, if you're doing stuff that's very alien looking, you want a kind of airless place, grab a height map of the moon. There's lots of them publicly available. Moon Crater's great. There are a few other different height map sources available that will give you different things depending on what you want. Looking at solar system planets in general is a good way to get ideas for color palettes if you have a planet that has like no references really and you don't know what the hell you're going with in terms of color. Okay, so that's the majority of the texture. There's still this area here where I want to blend in some of this a bit better. I think I might make this this green texture here a little darker. I want to bring in some dirt to create the road. Because one of the important things about making a map for real-time strategy games, particularly, is you want to draw the player through the map in a particular way, usually. You want to provide suggestions as to which way they should think about going. So in this case, this makes it look impassable. This green here will probably make it look pretty impassable to the player. What you want is the playable area to have a very consistent feel, have a very consistent color scheme, so that it's clear to the player where they can and can't go. So I'm probably just going to flatten out a lot of this area, because the default map boundary of 640 size, which is you can adjust in the map properties, is actually working pretty much perfectly for this map. It cuts off this mountain in the corner. We have this mountain still part of the play area. This mountain is cut off. And then you have this area here just acting as probably a tree break. So let's have this texture blended in a little bit here. Blend this in. Just add a bit of blending here, because this will be a bit nearer the player's camera view. Let's add in some more of this. So this is very, very faint, obviously. Like this, the contrast here is very low, but it can be enough to get the player to understand which way they should be going on the map, to understand which areas are actually passable to their units, and to understand the kind of general feel of the kind of attack paths that the map expects them to take. So this kind of plains area is pretty awful. It's a pretty good area for specifically Phoenix Rising, because we have a lot of long-range vehicles. And long-range vehicles need large, flat, open areas to actually work, because the game doesn't work very well when you have height differences. You'll just shoot into them and just be generally obnoxious about it. So this will probably end up being a large open area, and sometimes that can work. Like I'll probably scatter a few rocks in here when we get to that stage, and maybe a few lone dried out trees, and that'll be complete. And it ends up being a kind of salt flats region where you have a large scale vehicle engagement, because I mean the player's going to be, or the AI potentially is going to be landing their forces around here. They have the choice of two different ways to go, and if they go this way, that's probably where they want to send their vehicles to get into the front of the base up here, and that will promote this area for vehicle engagements. Just fill in a bit here, because there's again some large areas. This is probably going to be a pretty dead area of the map, unfortunately. And when you have those dead areas, a good thing to make them less dead is to put in, hide in a communications array, hide in an abandoned prison, hide in a landing zone. I think a landing zone is a good choice here. Having a safe landing zone for the attacker hidden far away can make it a bit more reasonable to attack a planet that might otherwise be impregnable. Because while this entrance is quite wide, it will be the heavily defended entrance. So turbo lasers, and again, Phoenix Rising, we have a lot longer range. Turbo lasers, let's just give you an idea of things. Let's go up quickly to objects. Let's just grab a turbo laser as an example, and turn on the object ranges. So that turbo laser, if I put a turbo laser there, which is a perfectly reasonable location to have a turbo laser, it will reach across almost that entire vehicle playing field, completely ruining any vehicle engagements that may be there for the attacker. So having this safe area way out of range, even if I put a turbo laser here, way out of range of any turbo lasers and attacks, it gives the attackers an opportunity to kind of refresh and bring in some more units. Okay, so this area is looking a bit high in the contrast, so let's actually grab this color and let's darken it a little teeny bit. And then you just mess with it until it starts to blend in reasonably well. Let's go with that. A bit better. Starts to look a little grey, but that's not too bad. And then just start to blend in the edge again in the same way you have previously. And there we have it. That is the first texture pass. It looks reasonably realistic in my opinion. You have the plains area, and we already have a kind of general idea of the attack-defend paths, landing zones, playable areas, and we have a ways to draw the player's eye through the map. This central area maybe not so much, but that's the obvious path anyway. That is the I'm going straight towards the base, whether they want me to or not path. Let's actually make that a bit more obvious by just, wrong color. Just splitting this hilly area here. I mean, you always want at least 2 ways to get out of the landing zone, if you can. The main landing zone, ideally 3 if you can get away with it, and you always want at least 2 entrances to the base. And again, ideally 3. This map's just probably going to have 2, and effectively 3 because you can send air units across the mountains there. Right, so that is the textures. Let's move on. I like to do nature whenever I feel like it, really, but let's do it now, because this is one of the other things where I take shortcuts really, really quickly. Load button. Now, there's a bunch of default environments in the game, again, that the map editor comes with, but what I've done is gone through every vanilla map and extracted their environment and saved it. So Bimasari in Phoenix Rising, I believe we have it set up to... We need rain, so I need to grab a planet that has rain and is kind of forested and has the right kind of approximate environment from vanilla, and then we'll edit it after that. But starting with this gives you a good level to begin with. So Seleucami is almost good. It's maybe a bit too desert. Wayland is too... Wayland, Thyfera, they're maybe too forested. Yavin, too forested. Let's go with that Zeri. That's a pretty good one. Then obviously you need to turn the fog off because the fog's impossible. Now, this lighting is maybe a little too orange. And the bloom is quite high, so the bloom is the kind of glow effect here. The bloom's quite high here, which is alright. But I'm not a huge fan of high bloom because it makes things look very early 2000s. So here what I'd probably do is just turn the bloom strength down to like 0.7 and turn the size down to 0.7. And then turn the cutoff down to 0.2, maybe? No. Turn the cutoff up to 0.5. I don't mess with the bloom very much. I usually choose the environment set that doesn't have that kind of thing. But I still don't think this is going to work very well for this particular thing. We want somewhere a bit drier, so let's grab Seleucami. That looks about the same, but it does have the rain. Let's see how the rain looks. See, this looks more reasonable to me. Now, because this particular planet is meant to have rain often, it's, while there are plains, it's meant to be partly rainforested. I'll probably just cut the clear map views. And so we'll just keep the sunrise at noon. And generally you want to go for the noon because that'll have the sun above the horizon. Let's just grab the right sky dome. Murk is okay, but let's actually go for more temperate worlds. I tend to prefer day storm. And sometimes, even when it's raining, having day blue isn't too bad. You get that sun shower effect. And if we look back at our reference, the Bimasari in particular, it looks like it's quite a nice day. So that implies their weather is generally pretty consistently okay. I mean, it's temperate, it's standard, all that kind of thing. So the rain is mostly here for gameplay purposes. But for now, let's actually just turn that off so we can actually see what we're doing. This gives you a better idea of how the textures are going to look under the right lighting. And it looks okay to me. You might disagree, but I think this is starting to look pretty alright. So with that, we've got nature in. Now let's just throw down some markers so that we have a vague idea of where everything is going to be. So let's just grab attacker entry position, throw it down here. Let's give it at least the right pointing. Point towards the enemy base. Always try and point towards the enemy base or towards the nearest exit to the landing zone, otherwise vehicles get very upset very quickly. Now, because the base shield marker doesn't actually show you the extent of the shield, I'll pretty much always just grab an actual physical base shield prop, which has the shield. Bam, base goes down. Let's turn the object ranges up, actually. There's the base shield. It's giving good protection to the base, maybe I even move it here. If it's good protection to the base, it protects this entrance. This entrance is slightly less protected, which is good, that's what we want. This is the sneaky side entrance. And then this is the throw everything at it entrance. Don't worry about base shields going off the map. Sometimes it's perfectly valid to do it like that, if you think it works best for your map. And then let's go get some other markers. Now, we actually have a comprehensive map planetary database that we use to, not that one, determine how many structures we have on our planets. So I'm just going to quickly grab that and find Bimasari to see what we've calculated. This is very helpful for me as a mapper when I'm doing Galactic Conquest maps because it saves a lot of time planning. So 3 turrets, that's 3 turbo laser towers, 4 land structures, so a relatively small base because it's a relatively provincial planet. So what I want to do then is go to the base. You always want to have at least one building that's probably forced to be outside the main base, just to give the attackers something to grab in the case that they, very rough of course, in the case that they can't, they don't have enough forces, they just want to do a raid and grab something, so we'll actually put an outbase structure. Now, I'd like to tuck it in right there, but then that means moving the edge of the map, which I think is doable. Oh, wrong bounds. 600 is probably fine. So it's actually the top, I think. Yeah, okay. So that's probably cutting it a bit too fine. Probably like 300 minimum. Oh, let's maybe even go up to 400. That's probably safe. Let's grab that outbase structure position in here. Now with outbase structures we use a mining facility as a marker, which is kind of awkward because it's difficult to tell which way it's pointed, but this back area is kind of pointed towards that way. So just make sure you get your buildings pointed in the right direction. And I think the power generator, as I mentioned, now there's a question of do you want your power generator to be easy to get for the attacker or really hard to get, and you can just put it inside the shield at the back of the base and no one can ever destroy it. That's kind of annoying when you're attacking, but really good when you're defending. It depends on the kind of planet and how biased you think you want to be with this. I think with this particular planet, it makes a decent amount of sense to just put it here. So it's kind of easy, but it's kind of tucked away. And then let's grab, so we got a grand total of, I think it was 3 turbo laser towers we can put in. Do you remember I checked the range of them, so they're pretty safe to be putting kind of here-ish, one under the shield. And then I think one here, just one defending this entrance. Now again, in Phoenix Rising, the turbo laser towers have very long range, so I want to make sure this one can't just shoot across. And this one can probably hit this entrance mostly, but I don't want to make it so that this area becomes completely unsafe. Okay, and that's the basic thing, so we can get an idea of where the base is going, the general layout of things, the quick, rapid layout, and then let's also put in some landing zones so we know where those are going to go. Let's grab. Now, the amount that you give the player to start with is very up in the air. I like 5 minimum usually to give attackers a fighting chance, gives the AI fighting chance to actually get enough units in, and then try and add up to. Then I'd like to also just add up to 10 total, so that the attacking player is encouraged to explore the map. But sometimes you'll have a completely tertiary landing position that is purely there to give an alternative instead of a required landing zone to get to 10 population. I think here's another good reason for a landing zone. It's reasonably flat already, and flat is the best thing for the game. So let's put a 4 over here. That gives us up to 9. Then we'll put another 4 over here. So you can get to 9 by just grabbing 2, but if you want 10, you will need all 3. Okay, so now we have some basic landing layouts in place, and I'll worry about the faction of them later. Let's start sorting out the height map. So this is where you want to grab your smoothing tool. Well, yeah, it's just the middle mouse button, man. In my years I've been mapping, I still can't remember that. And then you want to turn the smooth weight up to the maximum because it's slow as hell otherwise. And then you want to just look for areas that clearly shouldn't be lumpy because they'll cause problems. So for example, around this landing zone. Oh. Okay, yeah. If you go into actually, let's just reset the passability. If you go into passability mode, when you smooth the map, it actually adjusts the passability as you go. Let's just smooth this area out, make this landing zone actually completely passable, make this an exit. and then just start to smooth this region. You generally want your brush to be at least 150, and ideally 200 if you want, if you can get away with it, because the wider these areas, the easier it is for the game to path through them. So let's make a nice large area here for the landing zone, and then start to smooth it up here to flatten out this whole path towards the secondary region here. Now this area should all be flat. I'm probably going to make it like a forested, primarily infantry only area. I love infantry only passability. It makes infantry a lot more usable in the base game and in mods. Just smooth this out by this building. This out, and then probably want to level that out in a moment, but now just smooth. So that's a nice area for the power generator. This entrance needs to be much, much cleaner. Okay, smooth the entire base out. You lose some of the interest, but what you lose in interest, you gain a lot in playability. That building's the wrong way around. Don't care. Doesn't matter. Something to fix later. And this area here ends up being a nice place for air units to drop across. Just make sure this area is as smooth as possible. Okay, and then just go back to texture and just double check that all these areas where it looks to the player like they can go. That's very, very important. Otherwise, it gets very frustrating for the player. So note that whenever you could leave the passability mode, it doesn't auto-update, so you need to hit the reset passability button. These areas here are kind of extraneous to the map, and I'll probably just make them impassable or steep or whatever, because they don't really achieve anything. This main path is what matters. Yeah, Skibby makes a very good point in the chat. You really want to make sure that you're aware of props you might be putting in near roads and paths, and making sure that the playable area is as clean as possible for the game's sake. Now, it might look like now the map's very empty in terms of like it's just one big empty space that you can go anywhere on, but that's what passability editing is for later, and adding in objects in a short while. So next up, I want to make sure that the base buildings are actually on level, otherwise you end up with really weird effects. So let's grab the leveling code brush, and let's see, this is Z197. 97, and just level this out. Because you're in passability mode, you can immediately tell if you're starting to make too much of a platform. You can see there, and then you just smooth it out. This one looks like it's going to be a bit of a platform again, and you don't really want that, especially if you want the base to blend in with the terrain a bit more like this one is going to. You may have a base that you want to look more urbanized, more militaristic, more whatever. And in that case, yeah, platforms might be brilliant, but then you just have to be careful that you get nice square edges, otherwise you'll end up with very weird looking effects. This one's like 87. Same. Get it in, and just make sure. Now the power generator doesn't matter too much because this area here will just be off limits. It's 176. Smooth that. And you can see we still have some interesting height variation here. So, particularly in Phoenix Rising's case, infantry will need to gain. They'll need to gain the high ground because our infantry are scaled. Yay! So this tiny unit here cannot shoot over this hill. So this is something I wrestle with quite often. You have to be pretty careful about it. So what I'm going to do here is probably just smooth this area out even more. Nice and big, maximum smooth weight. Just go to the wireframe view and smooth it out as much as possible. In vanilla, the infantry are big enough that you don't have to worry too much about this kind of thing. Not as much as I have to. But it's still good practice to try and keep areas where you expect fighting to go on as level as possible for the sake of the game's terrible targeting mechanics. Okay. Action wireframe. Sometimes the game gets very upset when you toggle wireframe and passability at the same time. Okay, let's save this again. Right, let's block in the major props. So first let's do the edge. It's quick, It's easy, it saves a lot of time. Now, canopy-wise here, I'm in the forest block, but that's terrible, because the forest block in Empire at War is all coniferous forest. What we actually want here is temperate forest, so you go into the temperate block instead. So there's the canopy. Now, Phoenix Rising again, we have a bunch of conveniently scaled props, so I have these large canopies, which are significantly bigger, and fill up a decent amount of space, and do a great job of just block in large areas of forest to fill in the edge of the map. Sometimes you let other terrain peek through like that, and it doesn't matter, because on the edge of the map, that's fine, it's just some forest in the distance. This edge is going to be the city, like I said, so we don't even need to worry here. Here's a bit of forest between the mountains, forest in this area. Real quick, real easy, saves a lot of time. Okay. This water area, again, water isn't a huge deal. The corner isn't brilliant, but it works well enough that it's not. It's just, it's off in the distance, lake, ocean, whatever you want to call it. Now, this area here obviously is not going to be able to be done with these canopies because they don't look very good when you're actually up close to them, even though Petroglyph like to use them a lot. So instead I need to start grabbing some different props in instead. So let's maybe block out the city first instead. So there's that big structure, the Tower of Law. And this is one of those things where you either start getting very, very creative with props, or you have a model and make you one. In this particular case, it's going to be getting creative with props. So temperate, I don't think there's anything that's going to be reasonable. What I'm going to probably want is urban. And then I'm just going to go through some of the props we have and see what fits. Sometimes, even if it doesn't look quite exactly the same as the thing you're going to be working with, that doesn't matter. You just go with something that looks about right. We obviously have a bunch of custom props in Phoenix Rising that make this a bit easier. So in many ways, this would be suitable. If the city is far enough away, this would actually be suitable because it's about the right shape. About the right shape. It's if it's far enough in the distance, you can get away with these smaller props, and it'll work reasonably well. Some of these more industrial-looking civilian structures, perhaps not a great choice. I could construct it out of walls. That would be very tedious. I might just go back and grab some of these build facades. This one is perhaps a good choice. It simulates that kind of faceted shape. Well, the alternative is to do a lot of prop manipulation. It can get pretty tedious, but the results can be worth it. Here, I might even just go for something that is non-canon and pick a building that looks similar but not especially the same. And usually that doesn't matter very much because people aren't going to go on the Bimisari Wikipedia page and double check that you've mapped it exactly the same. And in this particular case, honestly, this tower, just having the tower there as the thing, is, I think, a pretty reasonable way to begin getting this set up. So next part of the city, or well, whatever approximates a city on Bimisari, which looks to be mostly small structures along the kind of feed line, which I think is a pretty reasonable starting point. So again, we want to kind of get an effect of the cascade of the city towards the edge of the map so that you have a sense of scale, a sense of distance. You basically bake in false perspective. And these don't even have to be realistically placed buildings. They just, because they're going to be in the background, they're going to be hidden by a curtain wall probably. You don't even really need to worry about exactly how they're going to be. You just have to make something that looks like a Star Wars city in the distance. And exactly what that entails is very much up to you as the mapper. In this case, I think these particular buildings are pretty good. They look like that kind of feudal-ish style of structure, which works pretty well in contrast to the obvious, like, modern metal thing that they've got in the middle of their city for some reason. And then when you get towards the actual area of the map where the player's going to see it, so again we go to hit the space bar and you see this area here basically. This is where you start to put in stuff that's scaled correctly, or as correctly as you can get away with. Let's see, how big are the walls that we have here? So look, the walls we have in the image here, pretty large. They're reasonably significant walls. Kind of this brick style is pretty good for them. But I'm not sure if it's going to be quite big enough. Just grab an infantry unit and see. You know, actually, yeah, that's big enough. I always forget how small our infantry are sometimes. Right, so we want this, and then we just start filling in a wall around the edge of the city. It looks like they have towers. That's easy enough to do because there's the Naboo walls have a kind of join. Actually, let's make this straighter. Make that 53 so it's easy to type in. And just start lining this up. You can once you get outside the camera view, you don't have to worry much about being exact. You can just start doing stuff that looks about right. Copy paste is always good too to get the same orientation of wall. And just kind of line it up as best you can. And you see here that it's starting to be, the height of the terrain is starting to be an issue, so that's when you get out the good old leveling brush. Let's see, we level about 200 here. You want to just get it so everything lines up reasonably cleanly. Just level this out, 50 radius, smooth it in. Because you're going to have loads of props on here and you want the area to be as smooth as possible for props. Just go back to the area we were in by selecting. Okay, and then we grab, these are going to act as towers. Obviously there are other tower props you can use, and again, when you're doing stuff in the base game, the scaling is a bit different. But I think in this particular case what we want is have a bit more interest. Now notice, this is part of the problem with using some of these props. They have issues with the base of the texture, the base of the prop being a terrible texture. So you have to cover it up with further props, and that's where it starts to get silly in terms of the kind of stuff you're working with and trying to get things lined up just right and so on. Okay. And there we go, now we have a tower. Let's just copy, oops, I was trying to select more than that. Of course, the issue when you copy paste is that the Z angle is not is not preserved. Oh yeah, as Skippy points out in chat, to place props, you select them, then you hold down Shift and then left click to place them, and then you can hold down left click to rotate them with the mouse, or you can control the prop positioning in the bottom left here. I mean, this whole video is really assuming that you have some basic familiarity with the map editor, because I don't really have the time to make an entire tutorial from scratch. This is more about the kind of techniques I use when using the editor more than how to use the editor itself. Okay, let's just copy this whole wall segment. Okay, it looks like they have these kind of big arched entrances, which is very convenient because we do indeed have some arched arched options in the Theed pack. Actually, just delete these. So again, lining this up is kind of annoying. Being able to type helps. Vertical, do I put that at 60? Okay, sometimes when props get lost under each other, it's really obnoxious, but there's nothing really you can do about it. You just have to fiddle around and deal with it. Sometimes it helps to use the fine controls here to adjust position. Can work. Oh, quite often when you click a prop, it'll move, so I'm in Control Z a lot to basically move the prop back to where it was before I clicked on it. This is where the time is really spent. These intricate prop pieces where you start doing some ridiculous complex stuff is really very, it can be very, very time consuming. Now obviously this is not quite right, so I need to take this apart. Now ideally I can get this arch in here. It's obviously not quite the right thickness. We probably want to have it like that. Looks like the heights of these has changed up a bit. So what? 69, 82, so 73, that one's at 69. Thankfully, a lot of these props have the same, because they have the same texture. You just kind of they merge in pretty well, and the textures tile, so it looks like it's all part of the same structure. Okay, and we don't have to worry too much about the holes here. It's something you can be filled in, but I think what I'll do if I do fill that in is grab one of these other smaller buildings, like that one, maybe. Option is let's just have a wall like so. Like I said, messing with props like this is half of what ends up being mapping in this game if you want to have stuff that looks good. My amazing job at choosing perpendicular angle. Okay. Down to the same level there, and then bring this down so it sits on top of that. Okay, so now we have a kind of entrance to the city. And let's start putting some more of these walls in around the side here to finish off the city edge. And it's pretty good to sometimes just merge structures into the terrain like this, so you end up with something that looks like it's built into the place instead of something that's just floating on top, which is what happens to a lot of mappers who don't really know what they're doing sometimes. Grab, oops. I'll just click on stuff, we'll move it a long way. Grab some forest and have it just kind of blur into the forest there, because the BIMs seem to like the trees, so a reasonable thing to be doing. Grab these columns, put it on the edge here. Now I'm blessed in Phoenix Rising, so I have a number of decent props, which are pretty handy for these situations. Around here, so we end up putting in temperate. We have a market stall. Now, this is particularly helpful for this place because if you notice, there's lots of market stalls outside the walls and inside the walls, and in fact that's half the point of this city around this law place. It's where did we put them? It's the markets. It's a whole market area just for the BIMs to use. Here we are, market stall. So let's just make a small market out here. And this will probably end up being just a mostly background, and you fill it in and have it in the city a bit. If you don't have props like this and you're trying to make this kind of planet, you can get creative with other options. There are lots of wooden crates that are quite useful. So let's now actually, this is where the texture starts to come in, because this clearly isn't appropriate to just have dirt at the base of this market. In fact, when you look here, it is in fact pretty dirt based, so it's not too bad. But I think having a strong contrasting dirt is a good option to go with, and making sure you've got a level area for the props is also good. You don't have to worry too much about smoothing these background areas because no one's playing in them. You don't really care about how perfect they are in terms of smoothness and that kind of thing. Let's have a look. So yeah, that tile rock is okay, but this is a place that's actually lived in. So there's this dirt. This dirt seems pretty good actually to start with, at least for the outside the walls. It's a kind of concretey dirt, and just have something that makes it look like a through. Concretey dirt. And then what I want to grab is some of the tile rock that is a bit more reasonable for this particular location. Something like this, which is actually, in fact, this reddish one is even better, which has actual substance to it. And then make sure you pick a bump map texture, and then the surface type is kind of important, but not very much. I think actually having the texture scale quite small here is good, because that actually makes it look like the flagstones are a reasonable size. Then you can just start filling in the city. Make sure you have a soft edge on the brush for this. Don't use any hard brushes, because then you end up with really unsightly stuff going on. Okay, then we want to go back to a nice small brush. Pick up, use the picker tool, grab that. Start filling in here, add a bit of dust in here. And the actual background here really doesn't matter. You can put whatever the hell you want here, because again, the player's only going to see this region here. So that's the important bit. That's where you put in the actual care into your prop placement. We start putting in some buildings towards the edge here. This is where I might actually bring out the spray brush. So the spray tool is a very helpful tool for placing large numbers of objects. Let's go get the actual scale buildings. You create a list, click the spray button. You can start just putting them down at random angles automatically. If you choose the list option, it'll pick from the entire list. So it'll pick randomly. So do be careful you deselect from objects first. Pick randomly and place them at a random angle, which is very helpful when you just want to get down stuff really quick for the kind of higgledy-piggledy town that the BIMs probably have, because they seem to be a somewhat feudal society. Okay. And then we have it. It's a good start. City, and then what we'll do, in fact, is grab some of those wood crates I was talking about. So I'll do the same again, just create a list. Actually, no, you clear the list, otherwise you start just spraying everything you've selected, the entire thing. And you just start putting these objects down. Spray tool in little piles. And it creates a natural looking marketplace. At least as far as Star Wars goes. The parts ones are pretty good as well, because they add a little more tech areas that might otherwise not have them. Obviously, the scale of these props is quite different in Phoenix Rising, so in whatever mod or whatever version of the game you're using, it will be slightly different each time. Okay, so here we have there's the BIM city. Next up, the forestry. Forestry is something I'm not brilliant at. It's one of the most tedious bits of making a forest map, ironically, and picking the trees you want to use is pretty important. So this is a jungle area. You don't really have many good choices for jungle trees in the in the base game, and even in the mod, we don't have that many that are relevant. We have the Bulba here, which is some other people's props that we're using with permission. But and these are some of the old trees that Petroglyph made. They're very deciduous style, but quite often just going with something like this alien tree. This one, maybe in the desert area, but this alien tree in particular in the forests, I think will look like a suitably weird tree to have. So note that there are the no shadow versions, and these no shadow versions are what you want to use on the outside edge of the map because it saves on GPU power. I mean, obviously that's not very relevant these days, but some people still run the game on old laptops, and so you don't need shadows for trees on the edge of the map. So picking stuff without the shadow is best. And so what I think I'm going to do here, let me just check how big our large version is. Okay, large versions are quite large, but that's fine. So again, spray tool to just get that randomness, and then maybe, so here I'm using the large ones as kind of the basis. So not very many of these large ones, but these will kind of be the basis, and then I fill in. This creates the major tree areas that are actually on the map causing issues for the player, and then I start to fill in with more reasonably sized trees. Now I've made a list, so I'm going to go back to current. Notice that this radio button doesn't really work very well, but it is doing what it says it is. What you select. So these are probably going to be, at least so this bit here, these probably aren't going to be infantry only areas. This bit here is, so I'm going to keep the trees more sparse so you can actually see where your units are as the player. It's pretty important. These triples of trees are very useful for quickly filling in areas of terrain with trees. And then I'll probably grab some singletons. Again, consistency of vegetation is pretty key. If you can keep your vegetation consistent, the whole planet feels like it's one place instead of just a mishmash of props that you've thrown together. So here what I'm going to do is grab a large, whoops, not cluster, a large, and spray the list. And this is where I'm just going to start putting individual trees in just to fill in the gaps, make it more of a canopy and less of a just blob of trees. This is one of the hardest parts, is feeling like how many trees is enough trees, how many trees is too many trees to get the effect you want. Because generally fewer props the better, because it kills performance in the game and can just look a mess sometimes. There I think I'm impinging on the landing zone a bit too much, but that's something I'll clean up in a bit. Just be a bit sparse here. Now always try and make sure there's a vehicle accessible zone for every building, because otherwise you end up with serious issues for structures that should be vehicle accessible. Like if this was a factory, I probably made a mistake here. So let's actually move that tree up there, move these trees around. Then what I'll do, in fact, is grab the path texture, blend it in over to that structure, so it's clear to the player again that they can get stuff through there. Again, let's just double check. So this landing zone, this tree is a bit too close. Okay. So that's the main forestry. I think next some rocks would be pretty good. I generally want to go large to small with props because the large props help point you towards where the small props should go. So because this is so brown, it turns out that desert rocks are probably the best choice for the generic rocks that we'll be using. So let's just clear, let's grab rock clusters, and then just go to town. Let me see, are there any others? That seems reasonable. Again, the spray button is your friend here. It saves us so much time. Start filling in around the mountainside. And we have some very large rocks, and these I'll have to individually edit afterwards. But yeah, a few on the edges of the forest areas is not a bad idea. Rocks also help point the player that this area might not be passable to their large vehicles. and it makes this entire area seem more impassable by just having an area of rocks. Now you'll notice a lot of them are off at weird angles, and some of them are too big, and it's just quite often I find that just sinking them into the ground is a good start. This one here just needs to be at an angle, so you just twiddle around with the angles until you find something that's appropriate, and then maybe sink it into the ground a bit as well. The especially difficult ones to work with are the wide flat rock props. They're pretty annoying. They're not very helpful in terms of getting the rocks in the right place. Matching the rock color to the environment's pretty good, but sometimes it can be nice as well to have some contrast. So if I grab some of the temperate rocks, which are much more grey, and they have some green at the base, but there's a lot more choice of them, which is nice. These are pretty good to just have around the edge of these forested areas, because they just match in a bit better with the forest, and they can fill in gaps like that in the trees that might otherwise not quite work. And it makes it more clear to the player that not even their infantry can get through this region, it's just too filled up with stuff. Okay. Next up we want some stuff in this area so it's a bit less empty looking. So again, we probably want to grab some of the desert stuff because that's the most appropriate for the region. So let's have a look. These Tatooine bushes might not be too bad. That one's okay. Okay. Let's grab the small ones as well into our list. Start dotting them around. Now, this is where you really want to make the scatter radius quite large, the intensity up to like 80, and then get the spacing up as well. That spreads them out, so you can just hold down the mouse button, and it'll just spread out the objects automatically. Let's actually go to 100 scatter intensity, and then you can just spray them down basically like you're paintbrushing the area with objects. So this dry scrubland now looks a bit more like dry scrubland and less like just an empty plain of rock. Sometimes you might have to go just to see how much you've done. Go into the wireframe view. I find with bushes you can always have more bushes. There's never enough bushes, but again, it's another thing that slows down loading times and map speed and stuff. So let's bring it. Yeah, these bushes probably will only stretch up to about here. Past that, they'll be a bit greener, and then you throw a few in here. Then around the back of the base, where it's a bit more kind of dirt plain again. Okay. So that's some bushes. Now there were those other temperate alien trees, which weren't very temperate looking to me. These are more deserty to me, but I think they don't have a shadow. They don't have a shadow, and they look kind of terrible. Pass. Yeah, trees without shadows, if they're actually on the map, look kind of terrible. But what I think I will do here is grab the A large individual ones. Actually, no, let's grab the cluster no shadow large. Go to current. Scatter radius 10, and then just drop a few in the edge forest, because then they stick out and they add a bit of interest to the edge forest, so then it looks just like these low-lying scrubby things. Okay, there we go, it's a bit better. Looks a bit more actually forested here. And let's add in individuals around here. And then it helps to just kind of, again, it's all about that blending. Just like with textures, you blend the forest areas together with the rest of the map. And don't worry if this isn't matching your base texture, because what you can then do, which is what I will probably do, let's not do that. What I will probably do at the end of this first object placement pass is come back to my textures, because obviously if you put a bunch of trees down on solid rock, you probably want to turn that solid rock into some grass or something like that. Let's grab our under tree texture, which is currently this one, just kind of spread it around. Again, find out some gaps, because especially on these outer areas, it's not a huge deal. No one's going to see it, except in the far distance in cinematic view, and that doesn't really count. Okay, again, this bit here. Now, some of these, the good thing to do is get down to the flattest level possible and look for trees that have, especially tree clusters tend to do this because their center determines their height. Which if they're just floating above the ground, it can look terrible and obvious. So it's a good thing to try and fix as quickly as you can. No, I was intending for this entrance to be a bit wider, so I think in fact I'm just going to get this entire tree zone here. Because you want a wide entrance to the base at least at some point. Just because otherwise you create choke points that are impossible for the player to get through, or for the AI to get through. Okay. So we've got first round of props. Now we're on to the second or third round. I've lost track. There's a lot of rounds of props that you end up doing. On a lot of prop tweaking. This is really the downside of the triple cluster. I have to go back and edit them a lot more than with the individual trees. Individual trees will just go where you put them. The clusters, not so much. They're a bit more obnoxious. Let's grab now, actually, some ground cover. Let's have a look. So we've got some greenish here. That one's pretty good, I think. Add it to my list. And then there's also stuff in forest that I think is pretty good. At least that was the last time I looked. Where did it go? Ah, there it is. So these are nice flowers, basically. Now, ground cover is great because it adds grass to what would otherwise be nothing. And I should note that the map editor does not the map editor, but the game does automatically conform your placed ground cover to the terrain, so you don't have to worry about editing the angle of the ground cover. Just fill it in under trees. Try and get it where there are green textures, because that helps emphasize kind of terrain that it is. And you can be really rapid with your clicking here, put lots and lots down. Again, Control W helps, you can see where it's going a bit easier when you look at the wireframe. The only real downside of these props is they're all square. So that's why you really need to be using the spray tool to get that random angle out of them, otherwise they're going to look pretty terrible. Again, consistency with these is pretty good to make it look like there's a consistent species of grass or whatever that's living on this planet. And try and do it very strongly in infantry-only areas, because for some reason grass, is deadly to vehicles. So cover your infantry-only area with grass, and clearly no vehicles can go there. And it may sound ridiculous, but that's basically what Petroglyph does with a lot of their infantry-only areas. Put in some really long grass and some trees, some rocks. Let's just check the coverage. Try and fill as much as you can, but again, you can go wild with props. We've already got 1300 on the map. and too many props will end up slowing the game down, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's essentially the kind of natural area of the map with the local stuff. Now the base is an area that I probably find the most difficult. Oops. In terms of getting them to look like they're part of the landscape or like they're part of the map, without them just seeing me like I've plopped down some buildings. So here it's very much I've plopped down some buildings. So I'd like to try and blend them in a bit more. A good start would be getting in some kind of concrete or rock that looks like it's the basis for actual structures instead of just dirt that we have here. Let's see. I think if I look for some actual... So this rock isn't too bad. It's just a bit too tiling. Let's have a look and see what we've got. Sometimes I'll just scroll through every texture just until I find something that looks right. The urban stuff is sometimes okay. Again, I like these tile rocks because they can look very natural in some cases. I think in this case some gravel might be a good idea, and I find actually these riverbed textures are best for gravel. Gravel is good for a base. Looks pretty reasonable in terms of like, oh yeah, they put gravel down, you know, it's a base. And then there's also this particular one that we have here, which blends in reasonably well with the actual. So this, I think, this color that I've just picked up here will actually be our blend. So if we go to 20, sometimes when you're blending, you just want to grab something and just do the edge between two completely contrasting textures to make them not contrast anymore. Okay. Base seems more like a base now. You've got these kind of general gravelly paths. You've got the heading off to the city in the background. So one of the other things you can do is to really get some walls in, and there are two options with walls. There are the standard urban walls, which are not destructible, or you can go all out and put down a lot of actual destructible walls, which I believe end up under ground structure or something like that. There's Empire Wall and Wall, which is the Rebel Wall. And these you place down to create actual base structure that is then destructible. People can drive through or destroy these walls. On this particular planet, I think it's necessary because the plains make it seem like any base you would build would need its own protection. Notice these walls do actually have a faction. So what I'm going to do first is actually create a level region. Look at, again, level 200 along the front of the base. Let's just check the passability. Okay, just go around here. That's obviously too high for this region, so what we're then going to do is grab the turn smoothing brush on, just to smooth it out. It's fine to be steep there, because that's just going to be trees. Okay, now we have a kind of lip to the base. Okay, now the hard part of placing these walls is just how damn tedious it is. It takes a lot to put down all of them. Let's actually just move that. Let's actually view. Can't turn off corporate because it's, yeah, anyway. So I tend to put walls down in straight lines or 45-degree lines because otherwise it will take forever to line them all up as perfectly as you want. And you'll never line them up as perfectly as you want, of course, but it's good to try and do as good a job as you can. Looks like this is a bit too high. Let's find out what's the actual height of this region. 82? I think this might be a situation where we actually want to put in some more natural walls instead of putting these artificial ones in. And in fact, I don't think I'm going to bother with them at all for this particular video because it's just a lot of tedious prop placement that no one really needs to see. I think I'd rather move on to the passability so you can see how easy it is to get that done in a rapid manner when you've already set up. We've already set up these areas that we know of as play areas, and we're just going to just double check, just reset the passability. The first thing to do is go to the steep brush, 200, and just start. Oh, look, it's a mountain. Block it in as steep. Be very, very strong with the passability because this is what helps the game determine where units should go. So in fact, I think this entire region here should be steep. This area here I actually need to smooth out because I don't think it should be. I think this should actually be a passable area. Also be infantry only, but it should be passable. By smoothing it out, you're ensuring that the region is going to be of an appropriate steepness for the base for the game, because the map editor knows it has, the algorithms it has to determine this are based on the game's engine, so it helps a lot. Sometimes these little bits just don't go away and they'll remain steep forever, which is annoying as hell, but then you just ignore them and just level this area out. So actually, yeah, it's about 100. Then we create the cliff on this side instead. Okay, there we go. I've actually got a level playing field, literally. So we paint that in steep. We go around, we do all this in steep. We go back to the edge here, and we just make it all steep. Again, you just make it steep, and just sometimes you want to just double check that you're not going too far in terms of like the textures that you've put down, because that can destroy the careful balance you've put in. And then don't try and avoid making narrow paths. Narrow paths look, they sound cool and they can work well, and like gameplay wise, for specific things. But once you start doing it too often, you end up with regions that just are unplayable. But again, this is something we just want to block in. Block in this whole area. And these little bits here, we just go back to the additive, we go back to passability view, and we just smooth them out. Smooth them out so it's as clean as possible. Just make the city here steep. Just make this whole area steep. Again, you just want to be as clean as possible with this passability stuff. Let's have a look. If we go back off the passability code brush and go back to our actual view here, this is actually mountain. So then we just cover them. Even though it looks like it could be passable, you just color it all in because it's better to keep the game as happy as possible. This whole area is steep. These tree areas could be infantry only, but I've deliberately made them reasonably dense so that it doesn't have to be. Now this lake could be cool for repulsors, but ultimately it's kind of pointless. It doesn't really achieve anything in terms of like getting anywhere special, so you just make it steep. If in doubt, just make it steep. Just stop the units from going there, because it makes everything for everyone a lot easier. Now this here, I've made it too steep. Let's actually go to the clear brush. I'm going to need to make sure I just do a nice circle around the landing zone. Because if you can land stuff on the edge of impassable terrain, the units will just get stuck. Which is obviously not something you want happening on your maps. Then we just fill in the entire water area as steep as well. So, flies can go over it, but nothing else needs to. Make sure this is nice and clear. This landing zone. Go grab the steep brush again. Fill all this in. So this area here probably needs to just be clear so that units can run up and smack the turbo laser tower with whatever they have. Just smooth it out. Plus it wants to be a bit more level for the turbo laser tower. So leveling curve brush, this is about 150. 50. Gently work this in and then smooth it out. Work it in and then smooth it out. There we go. Got a kind of platform for the turbo laser there. This turbo laser is pretty well defended, which is good. Okay, that's heading towards being a reasonable, and if I hide all the objects, you can see that starts to become a very straightforward play area. Again, let's just mark it steep. This path here is a bit narrow, but it's going to be less trafficked, so it's not a huge deal. Like the player shouldn't usually want to care about going through there. It's just an option if you want to ambush stuff. And now this needs to actually be moved more into the middle of this clean zone. And we need to just clean this up. The smooth brush again. Okay, let's go grab passability, and finally we do the infantry only area. Mountains wise, I don't like to make them impassable, primarily because the airspeeders we have in Phoenix Rising are meant to be high altitude. So it doesn't make sense for there to be too many impassable mountains. Obviously, if they're very steep and tall, then make them impassable, because otherwise it'll look really weird when your speeder goes over them. But otherwise, just making them steep is generally good enough, and giving speeders as much free rein as they can get, because they're pretty fragile. The other thing to do, make sure you hide objects to look for small gaps in the passability, because that can really hurt pathfinding. Fill that in. And look at these small little gaps the game can't really deal with. Don't even worry if they're connected to textures precisely or not. That's not a huge deal with some of this stuff. Whoops. So sometimes the passability brush gets a bit confused about what you're doing. I keep infantry in the areas like reasonably segregated though, so that they don't just get run over by vehicles accidentally. Right. Okay. So the other thing I would do probably here is get in some greener bushes. So we'll get in. We do need a little more in the way of ground cover on the map in general. This stuff out here in this plains area is fine, but I think I would like some temperate bushes. Don't go too wild, just enough to add some suggestion of ground cover around the edge of some of these areas. And obviously these props don't affect passability, so you can just put them out and infantry will just walk through them and vehicles will just drive through them and stuff. It looks nice most of the time. Okay, and then another thing to do is put these bushes, especially if we just select the large ones, just put them on mountainsides, and they look like distant vegetation, stuff that's much larger than it really is. Okay. Let's just do a final pass of markers to make sure we've got everything. So, we have an attack entry position over here. Select these neutral, otherwise you end up with map bugs. Okay, select on the wrong thing there. Very convenient just to scroll through these with your mouse wheel. Okay, so you have an attacker entry position. Don't need set phase reveal, it's nothing. Okay, base shield structure position, so we'll put that in and then delete the placeholder one we had. I also, in Phoenix Rising, we also need a small one, which just covers a couple of buildings here. Right, defending forces. So let's get the defending units in. So we'll have one over here in this gravel pit area. We'll have one defending the town. Try and make sure the pointing is reasonable. Have a couple at the front of the base. Don't have them too close together because otherwise in the Galactic Conquest map picker, the map layout view, you're going to have some problems with them being too close together. You want 10 of them, minimum. More if you can fit them on, but it's not necessary. Try and always have at least one landing zone that the defenders can hold to begin with, so that the attackers have something definitive to work towards that will cause some combat. Okay, and there we go, there's 10. Spread out reasonably around the base, but not too close. Yeah, if you put a marker on a landing zone, the units on it will automatically capture it. That's how the attacker entry position works. Okay, line defender retreat. Yeah, don't need that. In-game bombing remark, you do need that for stupid reasons. Goes on there. Just hides out on the edge, no one notices. I'm actually going to put another outbase special structure out here, just to make this area have some value to it in case the player, because players can choose which of these they put their buildings on. They may want to have something hidden away at the back there. And for the AI, if they build a lot of buildings which are considered outbase structures on this planet, then they'll get spread out like that, and that can be pretty useful. We don't need any of that stuff. We don't need a random secondary structure. We don't need power. We've already got the power generator down. Got reinforcement points. And we've got stabilizers. So now all that is left to do is generate the AI data. This basically creates hint zones so the AI knows what's where. You just automatically do it. It'll generally conform it to your height map. This is another reason you want to make your passability simple, because these hint zones work off the passability contrast. And you can see how it's tracking the steep here, so the AI knows that these zones are steep, so it doesn't bother trying to evaluate it. It knows that these are infantry only. That helps the AI work with pathfinding, so it's important to be careful about that. And there we have it. In 2 hours, we've gone from concept to final Galactic Conquest map. This map wouldn't be particularly suitable for turning into skirmish, although I could imagine you could probably get away with a base here and a base here, potentially. But if you're making skirmish maps, what I suggest is you look at how StarCraft 2 does it, because that's probably the most developed real-time strategy game in terms of how maps are made. Company of Heroes isn't too bad either, for more naturalistic maps. And one thing you can do with your height map is essentially mirror it. So you get this height map, say I took this bit here, and I drew a diagonal line, and then I flip it across. And then you end up with a mirrored map, and that saves having imbalance in your skirmish maps, because that's the risk with these more natural maps. In Galactic Conquest, it doesn't matter. You can have as imbalanced a map as you want. No one cares, because it's attacker-defender. There we have it, Bimasari, a kind of temperate foresty plains world with a small base, and hopefully some interesting vehicle combat areas and some areas for infantry to sneak in the side and blow up that power generator. So thank you for watching. I think that's it. I don't think there's anything else I need to talk about now, so end of the stream. Thanks for watching, folks.